Welcome to Command and Control, a podcast series about military command and the control measures used to orchestrate combat engagements and wars. This show is sponsored by Systematic.
Systematic's world-leading command and control software, the Citaware Suite, is in use in 16 NATO countries and more than 50 militaries worldwide. Its open architecture allows complete integration with legacy systems while meeting all NATO interoperability standards, and its intuitive interface bridges language and domain barriers across alliances.
Last week, I was at the NATO Command and Control Centre of Excellence annual conference in The Hague. Just after that conference, within an hour or so of it finishing, I recorded a hot wash-up with Colonel Meitta Groeneveld, the commander of the centre. We really wanted to do a fast turnaround of what was talked about during it. I won't go any further, so here's our conversation. Okay, so we're sat in The Hague. We're about an hour after the conference is finished. We've just done the teardown, and we've just spent 2.5 days with 160 people sat in a room and some breakout sessions talking about command and control. And I'll get to the subject in a minute, but let me situate this for you, right? So this was an audience that ranged from students to 4-star, with a lot of 1 stars, 2 stars, and 3 stars in the room as well. We had scholars, scientists, researchers, politicians, government representatives, of course, the military, academics, theorists, and just the intellectually curious. And it was multinational, right? It was majority NATO, yes, absolutely. But there were also friends and partners there from places perhaps you wouldn't expect in the Indo-Pacific. And therefore, it really brought together this community of interest that wanted to get serious on a discussion about command and control. It was the NATO C2 Centre of Excellence annual conference. You might remember that I did it last year, and I'm here again 1 year on to record a sort of hot wash-up about it with the commanding officer of the C2 COE, who's also the one who put the conference together pretty much, supported by a fantastic team. But the topic, Mietta, was about command and control in multi-domain operations and synchronization, or another way, MDO and synchronizations and C2. You know, these are 3 big chunks to put together, right? I mean, they're huge. And within that, we broke out to a whole host of things, which we'll talk about over the next week while you and I having this conversation. But the topic itself was pertinent, timely, interesting, useful. I mean, how did you center on it? I mean, selecting a conference theme is really quite difficult. But, you know, Mietta, tell us.
Yeah, well, we have been involved in this MDO concept, and we are very much involved now in this cross-domain command concept. We will come to talk about that. And we see that although most of the time people will say, yes, it's very clear now, in the end, it's not very clear. So we really wanted to be in that part of the discussion that is very unclear and see whether we can help to shed some light on it. And we thought, okay, we're looking at this. There's a lot of discussion on synchronization because it says we need to synchronize our actions with civil actions to get to converging effects. And that is a big part of it. And MDO still is in its conceptual phase, I think, and we have made really significant progress. But there's still also a big disconnect, and one of our speakers pointed it out. There's still a big disconnect between the thinkers, and we probably, some of them, and the doers, the operators. So
yeah, I mean, it was explained as a Babylonian confusion, and it really is. You know, when all the word soup went up there, the differing definitions, interpretations of MDO, MDI, synchronization, orchestration, harmonization, effect. I mean, it was chaos, right? And clearly the audience had 160 different interpretations in their head of the same thing. It's incredible that we're still at this stage when you and I might think MDO has been around for us maybe 10 years, right? But for others, it's still brand new. It's still something that they get to interpret rather than written in doctrine. And it is. It's a mass confusion, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And there's a lot of doctrinal confusion. I think that what is written down is, of course, obviously a little bit ambiguous because it needs to be ambiguous because we all need to agree on it. So we wanted to move away from the discussion on terminology, and we'd say, okay, take it. It's out there. It has been accepted by all nations, this NATO MDO definition. So whether you want to call it synchronization or not, it doesn't matter. It's about the actions that are related to that. And for us, those actions to the synchronization part is how do we synchronize the military actions with the civil actions? And then not, when you look at the broadening of MDO, that is not just about the civil actions to support our own actions. No, it's really about the civil actions that are at the same time aimed at our mutual goal.
And our mutual goal being the key message of deterrence, right?
Yes.
I mean, it's active now. It's not something we're preparing for. We don't have to wait for Russia to invade yet another European country. The key activity is deterrence right now.
That's exactly the case. So we really wanted to talk about this continuum of conflict, because that's where it gets a little bit awkward for us, because we like it when we are in the lead. It's ready, but we're not in the lead. The military isn't in the lead. And we want to deter today. And deterring Russia is so much more than we just inside the military can do. So in order to really be able to deter Russia today, and they are attacking us in many different ways and forms, is to make sure that we get our allies and everybody who is on our side, get a little bit our actions aligned and see how we then can get to those converging effects this MDO concept is talking about. That's a mindset change. And that's also part of the confusion, where a lot of people will immediately talk about when we are in the lead. And another set of the people will assume that this is just the military part and it's about the civil entities supporting us in our military task.
And it gets back to some of that word soup that's associated with MDO, right? And it becomes a series of amazing infographics that look incredibly complex. But the reality is this is about cohering, collaborating, putting together some of the things that we can do in order to deter more effectively. And that happens at the command and control level. It is not something that individuals try and do, but it's definitely at the C2 level. It's definitely an area where you are perhaps at the operational, maybe the strategic level, where you're talking across instruments of power, not just the military.
Yes. And so it's also about now nations are in the lead. So it's also about extending those C2 lines and realizing how in those 32 nations, all these C2 lines are different. And you'd like to see how the decision-making is done there, but also how we link into the integration of information at the governmental levels that bring together those other instruments of power in order to get some alignment multinationally with as many nations as we can on what we want to achieve.
And I guess this is where we had a discussion about where the future of C2 is. And we were lucky enough to have someone from NATO ACT, Allied Command Transformation, come over and talk to us about this idea of the cross-domain command concept. Yet another acronym for us to get our heads around. But this idea that actually our C2 structures have to change. Here's a concept that starts to look at them a little bit more, right? You and the team here at C2 COE have been intimately involved in this since the start, right?
Yes, we have been. And they framed the cross-domain command concept as the C2 of MDO. So it's like MDO C2. And it really taps into those elements, what we're talking about, what is now needed to enable that. So it really cuts back to principles for C2, because when we're talking about concepts on the Allied Command Transformations part of NATO, they want to bring those concepts out, and they are just concepts because they need to be implemented in the 32 nations. Therefore, it's helpful to talk about principles and leave also a lot of wiggle room for nations to do the implementation of that along the lines of that concept without subscribing, the nano factors of it. So the principles they talk about is decentralization. So authority and decision-making are distributed to those closest parts of the operation. So it's not collaboration, and that's really emphasizing the shared situational awareness, cooperation across domains, and this alignment with non-military actors. And I think we will go a little bit further on that, it's really on the integration of technology. We see that there is now a different balance between the human and machines, and we need to find a good way on enhancing our decision making and also see where technology is changing the way we can do RC2.
And that for me was really interesting because the discussion we had on this concept, which was pleasing a lot of the scholars, was a proper concept. It didn't disappear into the realities of JADC2 and systems and processes. It kept it really at the conceptual, theoretical level, and it gave us a handrail. But it brought out one of the key factors was not just technology, but the idea of data and how we need to shift our thinking to data, but then about the relationship between the data and the human, which is something I've not heard spoken about at a sort of conference level in an open discussion with a bunch of people who are passionate about it. This sort of generated a huge amount of discussion, right?
There's so much to say about that. But one of the speakers, he pointed out that we will most of the time talk about information sharing, but he really would like to see a shift to data sharing. And I think it's a valid point because when you share information that's already analyzed, that's always analyzed from one point of view. And if you share the data, then somebody else can do analysis based on that data and from a completely different perspective and get real important takeaways from there. So I think sharing data in a broader sense, and that's not just within the military, I really mean on a broader sense, that can really help us as a whole to get better assessments out on what's going on. And then there is the part where we see that normally we focus a lot on military data and intelligence data. We would sort of think that's what it's about. We see now that it's probably already like 95% of the data that is open source data, whereas the intelligence part and the really sensitive classified part is probably less than 5%. And then there's also kind of a bias going on because when we look at data and we think, okay, this is classified data, our bias is it's of a higher quality. And that doesn't need to be the case. And then the third thing I would like to say on that, there's really a need to share that data, but we're automatically skewed not to do that because we have a lot of regulations in place that do not allow us to share it. And we are very, very keen on being compliant to those regulations. And we forget that regulations are in place because you want to avoid chaos, but you also would like to make sure that you're putting the regulations on the right place. So now it's all about the risk. So what's the risk of not sharing that data? Do we have a good analysis on that? And one of our speakers also really made clear we really need to have good risk management and risk assessment, where you then make deliberate choices on what regulations you can follow or not, and when you need to follow those regulations or not. I'm not applying for not being compliant, but on the other hand, we need to realize that many of our regulations are outdated. And so the cost of opportunity in, let's say, business terms is very, very high if you keep on outdated regulations that are in place.
It was noticeable to me, that the frustration from the Americans, our no foreign friends, who were pushing the need to share more than their European counterparts. There was a recognition at the highest levels from attendees from the US military in particular that their need to share wasn't right, that their philosophy was wrong. And they accepted the idea that in some circumstances we'll need to do this. But in many ways, it was referencing their culture of a way of passing information that reverted automatically to a classification type thing because they believed it was more secure. The reality being, of course, that some methods of passing information now are more secure using encrypted apps than they are by using some of the older systems that we have. I don't think I was surprised, but I was shocked about how open they were about the need to share and balancing the operational risk of compromise of systems or assets or individuals or capabilities with the reality of being able to operate and to operate effectively with the allies, right?
And I think several of our speakers also pointed out that thinking that because you have it behind this classified system, it's more secure is probably a mistake as well. We are not so much different from a bank or from a hospital when it comes to sharing classified information. And so keeping it safe and is probably in best hands, doing that by civil systems that are always updated and always getting the highest standards on how can we keep the data safe, instead of trying to do it ourselves and probably try to do it with outdated, huge systems. Not I'm saying that we're not doing that right, but what I'm trying to say is that we want to, in this MDO concept, it also talks about securing on the data instead of securing the whole platform. And there, the best way to go is probably go with the best systems that are out there at that time, at that place.
What was interesting to me was within that, the conversation was about a we and for us to do it. And that was an incredibly inclusive term, which in a military audience is unusual. I mean, we both have a history in the military, me further back, you're currently serving. But, you know, to say we in a military group of people means that you were on the same ship deployed at the same time. You were on the same submarine that went and hunted another submarine. You did an operation together. You were in Iraq with a certain brigade or a battle group or a company house in Iraq in 2003 or in Hague 9 in Afghanistan or whatever it was. We becomes very, very exclusive. And we also refers both nationally as a military or across NATO as a military. It's an exclusive term. The use of the conference really surprised me because the we they were talking about was a community that included all militaries of the coalition of the willing. It included academia and partners. It included government. It included politicians. It included industry and the force sector. I mean, this was a real break from most things I've seen in the military, the sort of military slang of exclusivity, of, you know, we're better. It became more like a proper community of national security professionals who really felt like they wanted to address this C2 challenge, right?
Yeah, I think that's the main point, probably. We come from a very military-centric view where we think, okay, we need to be independent. We need to be able to do everything ourselves because when it gets really hot, nobody can be near. We see in Ukraine that that's actually not the case. We see that civilians are out there way and everything that is done can only be done also because we have industry in place and we have civil entities that run the business and do stuff. And so there are we, of course, when we are talking about protecting our societies, I think the we is a lot larger. And I think also others really want to be involved by us, if us is the military, because they also really want us. I mean, in fact, in the conference, somebody mentioned that as well. We really want you to ask us to be on your side. And that's for industry. We always assume that industry only gets in there because they have a profit behind it. But at this moment, it's really vital to recognize that, yes, they want to make a profit, of course, but on the other hand, they also really want to serve the nations that they want to serve and they want to show their values. And they actually want us to include them in this and make them part of this common effort that we have to keep our society safe.
It was striking to me when we had the presentations from Ukraine and the Ukrainian visitors that what we saw from them embracing the we community, industry, politics, academia, government, and finance, that they released a latent potential in their society, economically, and certainly in manufacturing terms, that then allowed them to do what many of us had thought historically was impossible. The idea of drones, 1.2 million drones produced this year, even if you're losing 10,000 a day, this is an enormous undertaking that they do, but only by including industry as part of the we, and including them at the right levels, as part of the command and control construct, as part of this discussion that happens right the way across the top levels, but is allowed to permeate down as well. For me, that was really impressive. It just reinforced what can happen in the cauldron of combat. And it happens in Ukraine, but it's not limited to Ukraine. You could reflect on the same things happening in Israel or in Sudan or in the Philippines or in Taiwan. I mean, these are all places where by including a wider community, you suddenly release huge potential that by limiting the we to the military, you just don't get, right?
I think, first of all, we, the military, we can probably win a battle, but we, the military, we can never win a war. I think that's what we see in Ukraine coming into play. The government is leading this drone part where they really ramp up production, but they are in direct contact with the military in order to make sure that they get the kit out there, innovate and develop it. At the same time, creating an environment where all kinds of small industry can ramp up and get linked, and they are creating this multinational coalition that is so much needed to get this done. And this is, I think, really where the sense of urgency comes from today for us. If we want to be deterrent, not only to Russia, but to all of our adversaries, that is beyond what we can do as the military. And so it's a we, it's a us. And these discussions need to include, and we cannot do anything without that broader community. We cannot do anything.
So there was an interesting point that sort of relates to that. Lots of people, when you talk about command and control, particularly with a military audience, they talk about the failures in C2 being really at the political level. There's no political will to get involved in these discussions. There's no political will to push harder. There's no will to spend. And in some ways, you can see that borne out in spending figures and people lamenting the fact that the population don't understand and they aren't ready. I was struck by the well-known senior politician who was with us, who completely reversed that view in my eyes, and I think explained with incredible clarity the desire for change, adoption, movement, action, activity, aggressiveness, and explained the situation that the society at large, often the silent majority, are deeply behind this. And it's just partly it takes time, partly it takes a mandate, partly it takes coherence and coordination across the political space, and partly it's because reactions in national security terms at the political level aren't just spending on the military. They're partly sanctions, they're partly manufacturing démarches, they're partly trade imbalances, they're partly supply chain issues. For me, it was quite a compelling argument.
Yeah, I think it was really unfair from us if we would have said it's all on the politicians, because it's definitely not. And I think it's also really fair to say when we look at EU and NATO, the EU is probably in the best place, or maybe in the only place, that they can do something on those the drive of the new technologies that are really driving that change really, really fast. But we need some kind of regulation on it. And the EU did bring out in time, or maybe not in time, but definitely they brought out very important regulations that will help us stop election interference, that will look at misinformation, that will look at the way we use AI. And those are challenges, and we see in the cyber domain exponential attacks going on. And it's there where we really need to see that when we look at the new warfighting domains, space and cyber, the EU is maybe in a better place than NATO is, or they are maybe a little bit ahead. And so it's really necessary that we get this cooperation between the two of them really well done. And I heard some great suggestions today, which we will not expose, on how that may occur.
I guess all that was quite uplifting in many ways. And the conference was, it had a positive vibe to it, that the movement was in hand, that it was running. But you couldn't get away from the underlying feeling, to quote someone who shall remain nameless, we are not ready. And that was a senior military individual who was deeply concerned about the state of our command and control against the threat of what is around the corner and already happening. So whether it's the cyber attacks, the attacks on critical national infrastructure, the war in Europe that's raging, the reflections of all of that and the discussions, the result where a senior officer turns around and says, we are not ready. There was not an intake of breath, but there was a sharp challenge. Yet nobody turned around and went, our C2 systems are fine. What are you talking about? Everyone sort of acknowledged, right, that actually we're not in a good place. Yeah. Would you agree? Do we need new C2, new leaders, new training? Is NATO C2 good enough right now?
Oh, well, asking the question is answering it, I guess. I don't think it's good enough at all. I think we really need to rethink what we can do. That doesn't mean that everybody's doing things wrong, because that is not at all the case. But we need to speed up our adaptation. And I think we are very much used to do things in a periodic way. We have a periodicity to it. Every 5 years we look at this, every 4 years we look at that, every year we look at this. And that, with the speed of change, doesn't fit anymore. And then if you want to attack that with the organization you have in place and the way you are used to take these decisions, that will not fit as well. So it's not just making your procurement process a little bit faster and making your planning process a little bit faster. It's about changing your organization so it can get more adaptable. And so you are getting to the place where you actually can adapt all the time. So I think one of the quotes that was mentioned today, and I really like that as well, because we always, of course, look with a sort of envy almost to the United States, and they're a huge country and they are far ahead in many of the things and many of the thinking. But on the other hand, when we look at the other 32 nations, and he quoted that there's actually only fast countries and there's slow countries in today's environment. So you better be on the side of the fast countries. And I think the other point that we wanted to share was, how can we make sure that more people are on the adaptable and are on the fast country side? That probably the only way to really do that is look out to other nations and look out to other entities that are already ahead and try to copy-paste, try to share best practices. Because if we're just going all in parallel doing the same, that's not going to speed us up. So we might learn from all kinds of IT industry that is out there that is very much used, how you really speed up innovation.
So I was fascinated by the conversation about speed. It always slightly annoys me, but this time I found it better, primarily because whenever anybody mentions speed, they mention better. Better doesn't come before speed at the moment. People are still after faster decision-making, not better decision-making. But now it seems to be speed and better, faster and better decision-making. I'm waiting for the day where we get better before faster, but I think that's still a way off. But it's a bit like the conversation with MDO, I think lots of people came to this conference thinking that multi-domain operations C2 is the end. And actually it's not. For me, the one takeaway from this conference was it's part of that journey that requires the agility that you talked about, organizational, mental, cognitive, institutional, intellectual agility that allows adaptation that's appropriate for the fight that you're in and moving towards that, being ready to move towards that and not afraid to change. I was genuinely quite excited by that because it was not something I sort of expected from a NATO conference. I sort of expected us to go, MDO's it, let's all work towards it and we're done, right? But it was a very different conversation.
Yeah, well, it's all physics, I always say. It's physics because we're not talking about speed. We should talk about acceleration. And that means you're not good enough if you just do this periodic linear thing. On the other hand, it's also not about second decisions. So sometimes we think it's all about, we need to get those decisions made in seconds. No, you need to get those decisions based on a truly broad coalition. And probably it's not even a decision you're taking, but you're trying to bring that coalition in somewhat the same direction, what we would call converging effects. And there, I think we need a lot of critical thinking. But let's not only have these thinkers, it's really, really getting it to the doers as well.
And I think, if I was to reflect on it as a sort of theme, what came out from the conference for me, there was less about technology. And bearing in mind, we were a sort of technology heavy audience, that there were people that had a penchant towards data and information and systems and solutions. The one thing that everyone sort of reverted back to, or the two things they reverted back to, right from the opening address and a remarkable keynote through an amazing set of engagement speeches, breakout working groups, decisions, feedback, dinners, breakfast, you name it, were these ideas of trust and leadership. Both complementary, both that people felt historically NATO had been in a good place on, but really wasn't necessarily right now. And that work needed to be done on both these concepts, right? And in one way, I was sort of disturbed. Oh my God, NATO needs to work on trust and leadership. But another way, I found it hugely reassuring that this community, a very specific community of interest, of really quite amazing people and great brains, was prepared to be that honest about the alliance and say genuinely, these are two areas that underpin C2 capability and our ability to deter and defeat adversaries in the future. We need to fix trust and we need to fix leadership.
Yeah, the trust part is really the broadening part. It's not trust in other military entities. It's trust in the civilian entities, in industry, in governments. And you can only build that trust if you start doing things together today. And because it's not magically going to come all of the sudden when you are at war, as Ukraine is, then all of the sudden that you then have to build those relationships. I think it's really vital for us to understand that this part of MDO, where it's about getting that in place, is actually today and at all levels. That's not just something that needs to be done by politicians. And so there, I think communities that we are building, that was part of our idea as well of the conference, let's bring together these groups and make sure that we enable them as much as we can to start building those relationships that will help speed things up, but also will really, really help to build this trust. And with bringing in also industry partners into our conversations, it also is part of giving trust and bringing them in what we're talking about. And I think one of our speakers, he actually pointed out that when you look at the cybersecurity side, it's pretty much the same. It's pretty much the same kind of discussions going on. And it's also really the same kind of challenges. And there we can really complement each other.
Listen, we've run out of time. We've only touched on a tiny sliver of what went on. We're going to take a few days, I think, to digest all of it and think about, what was there. Congratulations, Mietta, again to you and your team on a fabulous 2.5 days. I need to go and wrap a wet towel around my head and drink some gin in order to digest what was done, but a huge success. Yeah. And if listeners are genuinely interested in the kind of discussion that we've tried to get across to you in the last 35 minutes, then please think about joining us next year for what is the highlight of the C2 calendar in my mind, without a doubt. And I do this day in, day out. Thanks very much for joining us. We'll speak again next time. The show is sponsored by Systematic.
Citaware is the world's #1 force integration solution, providing full C4 ISR capability across the globe.
We hope you enjoyed the show. As well as telling your friends and colleagues about it, please do subscribe and leave us a review on any of your usual podcast streaming platforms. This really helps us to reach new audiences and to spread the word. This episode is produced by AureliusThinking.com as a show for the Wavell Room, the home of intellectual curiosity and challenging thinking for military professionals everywhere. Thanks for listening.